My brother-in-law Marcus got me the job, which should have been the first sign I wouldn't enjoy it. Not because Marcus is a bad person. He's fine. He just has a habit of presenting things as favors when they're really just things that are convenient for him. The shop needed someone for overnight inventory and light security. The previous guy, Marcus, called him the previous guy the whole time. Never used a name had left without notice about 3 weeks before. Marcus co-owned the place with a man named Gerald Pickett, who Marcus described as a silent partner in the way people describe someone when they mean the partner who does all the actual work. Pickett ran the day operation. Marcus handled financing, which as far as I could tell meant he occasionally deposited checks and forwarded emails. I had been out of steady work for about 4 months. I wasn't desperate in the way people mean when they say desperate, where they're behind on rent and eating crackers. I had savings. I was fine. But I was also 41 years old and had spent the previous decade doing inventory management for a regional freight company that had stopped existing in a very quiet, corporate way the previous spring. So I was the kind of not desperate that becomes desperate if you give it enough time, and I knew it. The pay was $14 an hour, which was low, and the shift was 10 at night to 6 in the morning, which was worse. But the job was also genuinely simple. I would arrive, review what Pickett's day staff had logged against what was physically on the shelves, fix discrepancies, update the database, keep an eye on the door and the cameras, and leave when the morning person showed up. Marcus made it sound like the inventory system was a mild disaster in a manageable way. I would later learn that Marcus had not actually looked at the inventory system. I drove out on a Thursday to meet Pickett before agreeing to anything. The shop was on a commercial strip in a part of town that used to be better. Not dangerous now, just faded. There was a check-cashing place 2 doors down, and a nail salon that looked like it operated about 4 days a week. The pawn shop itself was bigger than I expected from the outside. The sign above the door said, "Pickett's Buy-Sell Trade," in red letters on a white background, and below that in smaller letters, established 1987. The security gate across the front window was old but solid. Someone had been repainting it regularly. That kind of maintenance tells you something about a person. Pickett was in his 60s, stocky, with the hands of someone who had spent a long time moving things. He wore a button-up shirt and reading glasses on a chain, and shook my hand like he'd been shaking hands since before I was born. He didn't try to sell me on the job. He told me what it was, what it paid, and what he expected. When I asked why the previous guy had left, he took a half-second longer than normal to answer. "Took another position," he said. I nodded like that was a complete sentence. He showed me the back room, which was where most of the real inventory lived. The front of the shop was the display area, cases of jewelry and electronics, wall mounts for guitars and power tools, a rack of cameras and optical equipment, shelves of smaller items behind the counter. The back was where things went when they'd been assessed and logged but not yet priced for the floor, and also where things went when they'd been on the floor too long and needed to be cycled. There were rows of metal shelving, a work table, a laptop on a rolling cart that served as the inventory terminal, a utility sink, and a back door that opened to a narrow alley shared with the nail salon. Pickett pointed to the door and said the deadbolt was the only lock, and I should keep it thrown at all times. The inventory system was, as Marcus had predicted, a mild disaster. It was some proprietary software from probably 2009, half paper-based, with a logic that had clearly been improvised and then never fully converted over. But I understood it within 20 minutes of looking at it. Systems that look complicated are often just systems that haven't been explained to anyone. Once you find the internal logic, even bad software makes sense. Pickett walked me through the tagging process. Each item got a physical tag, Small, cardboard, zip-tied or looped, with a 6-digit item number, the date of intake, the category code, the initial assessed value, and a brief description in the notes field on the corresponding digital record. Some tags also had handwritten annotations, which Pickett said were his or the day staff's, and were usually just shorthand for condition notes that didn't fit the standard fields. He showed me a tag on a boxed camera lens. Someone had written "Fungus Interior Disclose" in small print along the bottom edge. He said that was important, that the tags were part of the record, and that if I found a discrepancy between a tag and the digital entry, I should flag it and not just assume one was right. I told him I understood. He seemed to believe me. We agreed I'd start the following Monday. The first week was exactly what it should have been. Quiet and boring and entirely manageable. I would arrive at 10, do a walkthrough to verify the store was clear, set the alarm to its overnight configuration, and settle in at the inventory terminal. Pickett's day staff, 2 people, a younger woman named Deshauna and a middle-aged man named Carl, were diligent enough that most nights I was reconciling minor discrepancies rather than hunting for major errors. A quantity logged as 2 when there was physically only 1, a date of intake that was off by a day, an item marked as floor ready that was still sitting in the intake queue. Small stuff. I had a thermos of coffee and a folding chair I brought from home because the rolling stool at the inventory terminal was slightly too short for me, and by hour 3, my back would notice it. I listened to talk radio sometimes, sports usually, but turned low. The front display area was lit by a few case lights they left on overnight, low and amber, enough to see if something moved, but not enough to read by. The back room had a fluorescent overhead that hummed at a frequency I mostly stopped noticing by the second night. The cameras were 8 total, 3 exterior, 2 in the front display area, 1 on the register, 1 covering the back room broadly, and 1 on the back door. The monitor was mounted above the inventory terminal, divided into an 8-panel grid. I checked it periodically, not on any formal schedule, just whenever I looked up. By the end of the first week, I had started untangling the inventory backlog in a way that was satisfying in the specific way that organizing things is satisfying when the disorganization has been bothering someone competent for a long time. The software was already making more sense to me than it probably had to anyone since Pickett first installed it. I wasn't thinking about much beyond the work. That's the honest answer. I wasn't particularly happy or unhappy. I was filling time in a way that paid, which was what I needed. The first thing I noticed that I couldn't immediately explain happened on a Wednesday night, my second week. I was working through a batch of items that had come in during Monday and Tuesday while I'd been off. Jewelry, mostly. A few electronics. One acoustic guitar that I could tell without picking it up had a crack along the top that hadn't been noted in the description field. I flagged it, added a note, moved on. Near the bottom of the intake batch was a box. A shoebox, actually, the kind with the lid on, taped shut with clear packing tape and logged as a single intake item. The category code was MISC-COL, which was miscellaneous collectibles. The description field just said, assorted ephemera, contents, TBD. The assessed value field was blank. The date of intake was listed as last Thursday, which was the day before I'd come in to meet Pickett. That should have been assessed by now. 5 days in and no value, no content list. Normally I would have just flagged it and left it, but the intake queue was otherwise done, and it was only midnight, and I had a long night ahead, so I pulled the box off the shelf and set it on the work table. The tag was tied to the box handle with a white zip tie. Item number, date, category code, blank value field. And in the handwritten notes area at the bottom of the tag, in small, cramped print, "Not ready. Do not open." I turned the tag over. Nothing on the back. I put the box back on the shelf and went back to the terminal. That's the part that bothers me more than what happened later. Not that I didn't open it, but that I didn't think anything of it. It seemed like just another picket annotation, a reminder to himself or the day staff. I had seen tags that said things like, "Do not price," or "Hold for owner," or "Need second assessment." It fit the pattern. I logged a note saying "Contents TBD" and "Assessment pending," and left it alone. What I did not realize until much later was that the handwriting on that tag was mine. I need to explain that carefully because I know how it sounds. I don't mean that it looked like my handwriting. I mean that I recognized it the same way you recognize your own reflection, which is not really a visual process so much as a knowing. The particular way I close the letters on a lowercase d, the way I tail an O sometimes and don't others, the way I make a lowercase t where the cross is slightly high and pushed left. I have the handwriting of someone who learned to write too fast and never saw a reason to slow down. But I didn't consciously register that on Wednesday. My brain noted it and filed it somewhere without showing it to me, the way brains do with information that doesn't fit anywhere they've prepared. I went back to the terminal. I finished the shift. I went home. I thought about it on the drive, but I thought about it in the abstract, the way you think about something that half surfaced from a dream. Not with focus, not with concern. By the time I got home, I had mostly forgotten it. The second time was the following Monday. I was doing my intake review and I found another item without a completed assessment. This one was a wristwatch, a mechanical one, older, sitting in a small plastic tray with a paper label on the tray, rather than a tag on the watch itself. The label had the item number and date intake date listed as the previous Friday, and the standard fields. Assessed value was blank. Description said, "Men's mechanical watch, vintage, condition, TBD." In the handwritten notes area, it said, "Leave on the shelf until Tuesday. Do not move." Same handwriting. This time I sat with the tray in my hands for a long time. I set it back on the shelf. Then I pulled out my phone and took a photo of the label. I don't know exactly why. I think I had moved, without consciously deciding to, from the part of a situation where you dismiss things to the part where you start making small records of them. It's a habit from freight work. You document before you understand, because once you understand, the documentation is often too late. I looked at the photo. I zoomed in on the handwriting. My first thought was that Marcus had been in the shop and written the note. Marcus is my brother-in-law. We've exchanged hundreds of notes over the years. Birthday cards, reminder notes when we were staying at each other's houses, the kind of small paper communication that happens between people who have been adjacent to each other for a long time. I know his handwriting. It's nothing like mine. His is round and slopes backward. Mine is cramped and upright. My second thought was that Pickett had hired someone else who happened to write like me, which is possible. Handwriting isn't a fingerprint. Similarities happen. I did not have a third thought that night. I replaced the tray on the shelf, left the watch where it was, and worked the rest of the shift normally. But I kept looking at the inventory tag on the shoebox, which was still on the shelf, still unopened. Now 3 items over, and 2 shelves down from where I was working. Not ready. Do not open. I hadn't opened it. It had been there 10 days now, and as far as the digital record showed, no one had assessed it. No update had been added by the day staff. No value had been entered. I pulled it off the shelf again. I was going to look more closely at the tag, compare it carefully, because now I was treating it as something to compare rather than something to dismiss. The handwriting on the shoebox tag and the handwriting on the watch tray label were identical. Same hand, same ink color, even a specific blue-black that wasn't quite the standard blue most pens run. Close enough to look ordinary at a glance, distinct enough to notice when you were looking directly at it. And it was my handwriting. I had not written either of those labels. I put the box back. I put it back, and I sat down, and I drank the rest of my coffee, which had gone cold. And I looked at the camera monitor for a while without really seeing it. The rational explanation I kept reaching for was simple, and it kept not quite fitting. Someone was writing the labels. Someone had handwriting that resembled mine. I had noticed a similarity that felt more significant than it was because it was late, and I was alone, and the human brain is an extraordinary machine for finding patterns that confirm whatever it already half suspects. That's what I told myself on the drive home. I told myself the same thing Tuesday morning when I was trying to sleep and kept not quite getting there. I called Marcus on Tuesday afternoon. I asked him, conversationally, whether he ever came into the shop at night. He said no. He didn't have a key to the overnight system. I asked if Pickett had mentioned anyone else coming in during off hours for any reason. Marcus said not that he knew of, and then asked me if there was a problem, in the way people ask when they're hoping you'll say no, so the conversation can end. I said everything was fine. I thought about calling Pickett directly, but I didn't have a clean way to phrase the question. Hey, I noticed some handwritten labels on intake items that look like my handwriting, and I haven't been writing any labels, so I was wondering what. What was I wondering exactly? Even framing it in my head made me sound like I needed more sleep. So I didn't call. I went back Tuesday night and I brought a piece of paper with me. What I did was simple. On the drive-in, at a red light, I pulled the paper off the passenger seat and wrote the phrase, "Not ready. Do not open," in my normal handwriting. I folded it and put it in my jacket pocket. At the shop, once I was settled and the first hour of intake review was done, I took out the paper, unfolded it, and held it next to the tag on the shoebox. I sat there for a while. The tag wasn't a photocopy of what I'd written. It wasn't identical in the way that a duplication would be identical. There were small differences. The spacing was tighter on the tag. The P in open dropped a little lower than mine usually did. But the overall character of the writing, the particular decisions a hand makes when it's been making the same decisions for decades, those matched. The high T cross, the tailed O, the cramped upright lean of the whole thing. I folded my paper and put it back in my pocket and finished the shift and did not look at the shoebox again. The third label appeared on Thursday. It was on a camera body, a 35mm film camera, older, a Pentax, sitting in a plastic bin with 2 lenses and a strap. The intake date on the tag was Wednesday, 1 day ago. Day staff had logged it. Day staff had done a basic assessment. There was a value in the field and a condition note in the description. The item was properly logged, totally routine, ready for the floor. The handwritten note at the bottom of the tag said, "Do not price. Not yet." Same handwriting, same blue-black ink. I stood there with the bin in my hands and I did the thing that I had been not quite doing, which was letting myself take the situation seriously. Someone was writing on intake tags in my handwriting. They were doing it on items that had come in recently, within the current week's intake in every case. They were writing instructions, not prices, not condition notes, not anything that fit the standard annotation patterns Pickett had described. They were writing directives. Do not open. Do not move. Do not price. And whoever was writing them had been in this back room, handling these items, touching these tags, doing it on the day shift, or in some window I wasn't present for. The items themselves I had been treating as incidental. I made myself stop doing that. I went back to the shoebox first. Still there, still taped, still unassessed in the system. I had left it alone for almost 2 weeks because the tag said not to open it, and the tag looked like my handwriting, and some part of me I didn't examine this part directly, not yet, had been treating it as a note from myself, without consciously acknowledging that was what I was doing. I looked at the watch next. Still in the tray, still on the shelf. Tag said, "Do not move until Tuesday." And Tuesday had been 3 days ago, and the watch had not moved. I pulled up the digital record. Nothing added. No assessment. No value. No update of any kind. And now the camera. 3 items. 3 tags. All with handwritten directives. All in my handwriting. All telling me not to do something. I photographed all 3 tags that night. I compared them side by side on my phone screen. The handwriting was consistent across all 3 in a way that confirmed it was the same person writing all of them, if it was a person writing them at all, which was the thought I was working very hard to keep at arm's length. I searched the rest of the backroom's shelving that night, methodically. Every item, every tag. It took 2.5 hours and ate most of my shift window for inventory work, but I needed to know the scope of it. I found nothing else. Those 3 items, those 3 tags, and nothing else in the room showed anything anomalous. I want to be precise about what I did and didn't do next, because I've thought about it a lot since then, and I'm not sure I'd make the same choices again. What I didn't do was open the shoebox. I know that seems like an obvious first step. I've had that conversation with myself many times. But the note said not to. And there is something deeply ingrained in me, from years of inventory and freight work, about not overriding a tagged instruction without understanding its source first. Tags are records. Records exist because someone, at some point, determined that the information mattered. You don't erase a record just because you don't know who wrote it. You trace the record first. What I did do was start keeping a log. Nothing digital. I didn't trust the inventory system as a private space anymore, which was a strange thought to have about a pawn shop software terminal, but I had it. I bought a small spiral notebook and kept it in my jacket. Date, time, item number, tag text, exact phrasing, photo reference. I was treating it like a freight discrepancy investigation, which is the only professional framework I had available, and which turned out to be more useful than I expected. The second thing I did was start paying attention to the items themselves in a different way. The shoebox, the watch, the camera. I hadn't thought about them as connected things, only as items that happened to share the tagging anomaly. But I started looking at them differently. The shoebox was contents unknown. The watch was a mechanical men's vintage piece with no maker's mark visible from the outside of the tray, which was unusual, since most mechanical watches of any value have visible branding. The camera was a Pentax, mid-70s based on the body style, with 2 lenses I hadn't examined closely. I examined the camera closely now. The lenses were in bubble wrap inside the bin. I unwrapped one carefully. A standard 50 millimeters. Nothing unusual. I unwrapped the second, and it was a longer lens, a zoom, older than the camera body by the look of the barrel construction. I held it up and looked through it with the aperture open. There was something inside. Not fungus, not the kind of optical degradation I'd seen on other lenses. Something physically present, a small object resting against the rear element. I could see it clearly when I tilted the lens toward the case lights filtering in from the front room. Flat, roughly circular, maybe the size of a large coin. I put the lens back in the bin. I did not shake it out. The tag said do not price, not yet, and some part of me was still treating the tags as instructions from a source I needed to respect before I understood it. I wrote the lens observation in the notebook. Lens 2. Object inside, flat, circular, approximately 35 to 40 millimeters diameter, material unclear. The following Tuesday, almost 3 weeks in now, Pickett came by the shop during my shift. This was unusual. He'd stopped in once in the first week, briefly, to check on something in the safe, but he'd been in and out in 10 minutes. This time it was closer to midnight, and he came through the back door, which meant he'd come through the alley, and he knocked twice before using his key, which I appreciated. He looked tired, not alarmed, just the tired of someone who'd been managing something for a long time. He asked how the inventory backlog was coming. I told him we were close to current. He nodded. He poured himself coffee from the machine on the utility shelf, his own machine, his own coffee. I'd been using it since the first night with his permission. And he stood with the mug and looked at the shelving in that way that older men in trades look at their workspace, not seeing individual objects, but the overall state of things. I asked him about the intake process, casually. I asked whether the day staff ever got behind on assessments, whether there were items that sat in the queue for extended periods without being fully processed. He said sometimes, sure, jewelry needed a second look if the first assessment was uncertain. Electronics sometimes had to wait for someone with more specific knowledge, that kind of thing. I asked if he ever wrote hold notes on tags himself. He looked at me over his mug, not sharply, but there was something in the pause. What kind of notes? He said. Procedural notes. Hold this item. Don't price it yet. That kind of thing. He said he did, occasionally. Yes. He said the day staff did too. I said I'd noticed a few items in the back queue with that kind of annotation and wanted to make sure I was handling them correctly. He said, just leave them alone until they clear naturally. If an item has a hold on it, the hold is there for a reason, and the reason will resolve itself. He said this in the specific way of someone stating a policy they've stated many times, not explaining it. I nodded. I said that made sense. He left 20 minutes later. I didn't show him the photos on my phone. I didn't ask who else had been writing on the tags. I had 3 clear reasons for that. 1, I didn't fully trust Marcus, and by extension, I didn't fully trust Pickett's incentive to be honest with me about something Marcus had probably not disclosed. 2, I had no coherent question yet. Only observations. And asking about observations before you have a coherent question tends to close doors rather than open them. And 3, the real one. The one that was sitting at the bottom of everything. The handwriting on those tags was mine. If I told Pickett about the tags, he would either confirm that he had written them, which would mean he was lying about something, because he hadn't written them in my handwriting by accident, or he would look at them and not recognize them as unusual, and then I would have to explain what I meant. And what I meant was, those look exactly like my handwriting, and I didn't write them. Either way, the thing I was protecting, the thin possibility that there was a completely ordinary explanation for all of this, would be gone. Once I said it out loud to someone else, it became real in a different way. I wasn't ready for that. So I stayed quiet, and Pickett went home, and I sat in the back room with my notebook and 3 items on a shelf, and the fluorescent overhead humming. The 4th label was waiting for me the following Thursday. It was on a small wooden box, decorative, the kind with a brass clasp, the kind people keep jewelry or letters in. Intake date 2 days prior. The digital record was complete value, assessed, condition noted, flagged as floor ready. But someone had added a physical tag after the fact. It wasn't a standard intake tag. It was a piece of cardstock, cut to roughly the same dimensions, hole punched and tied with a strip of white zip tie through the clasp of the box, like someone had made their own tag to attach it after the fact. The handwriting on the card said, "Not with the others. keep separate. Same ink, same hand. I looked at the 3 items on the shelf: the shoebox, the watch, the camera. They were together on the same shelf, which was where I'd first found them, which was where I'd left them, which was where Pickett's staff had presumably placed them during intake. Whoever had written these notes knew where the items were. Whoever had written these notes knew they were together. Whoever had written these notes was telling me the wooden box should not be with them. I moved the wooden box to a different shelf. I moved it to the far end of the room, near the back door, on the bottom shelf where the cleaning supplies were kept. I wrote the new location in my notebook with the time and date. Then I went back and stood in front of the other 3. The shoebox, the watch, the camera with the object inside the lens. I had been treating the tags as procedural instructions, but I was starting to understand that that wasn't quite right. They weren't instructions from someone managing inventory. They were instructions from someone who knew what those items were. And the handwriting was mine. I went home that morning and did something I hadn't done in about 2 years, which was pull out the box of my father's things from the back of my closet. Not because of anything obvious. There was no direct connection I could point to, no logical thread. It was more that I'd been avoiding a particular kind of thinking, and the 4th tag had made that harder to do. And when I can't avoid thinking about something, I tend to do it physically. Move toward the thing instead of away from it. It's not a personality trait I'm especially proud of, but it's mine. My father died 26 months ago. Stroke. He was 72 and had been managing his blood pressure badly for a decade, and it wasn't a surprise when it happened, which somehow made the 6 months afterward worse rather than better. Grief without shock is a particular kind of long. There's nothing to absorb, nothing to get through. You just carry it at the same weight every day until one day you notice the weight has changed and you can't pinpoint when. He was a collector. That's the word the family used, collector, which was generous. He collected with the specific enthusiasm of someone who has more passion than discretion and more space than he should have been allowed. Coins, primarily. Old cameras. Small mechanical things. Watches. Clocks. Music boxes. Estate sale finds. Things he'd buy for $20 and spend 3 weeks researching and conclude were worth either $12 or $400, and be equally pleased either way. It was the research that mattered to him. The object was just the occasion for it. I had kept some of his things and given others to my sister and stored the rest. I wasn't particularly sentimental about objects, which is probably why I ended up in inventory work. But I'd kept the box. I sat on the floor of my bedroom with the box open, and I looked through it without knowing what I was looking for. Letters, mostly. A few photographs, his handwriting on index cards, research notes about pieces he'd owned or was considering. And his handwriting was not my handwriting. His was looser, more generous. The letters spaced out with the confidence of someone who'd been told his whole life that he wrote beautifully. Mine was cramped and utilitarian. Nothing alike. I closed the box and put it back. Whatever I was reaching for wasn't there. I knew that. I think I just needed somewhere familiar to put my hands while I let the real question come forward. The real question was, how does a person's handwriting appear on objects they have never touched? I spent part of that day, before I slept, going back through everything I could actually verify. I had started the job 4 weeks ago. The shoebox had an intake date of the day before my interview with Pickett. The watch had an intake date during my first week. The camera during my second. The wooden box most recently. 4 items, 4 tags. A span of 4 weeks that corresponded almost exactly with my time at the shop. Whatever was producing these labels had started around the time I arrived. Or at least, that was when they became visible. I couldn't rule out the possibility that there were older ones I had missed, items long since sold or moved to the floor without my noticing the annotation. That thought sat with me long enough that when I woke up Thursday evening, I decided to check. I went in early, 40 minutes before my shift officially started, which meant Pickett's day staff were still there. Carl was at the register. Deshauna was in the back, doing end-of-day counts. I told her I'd had an idea about the inventory backlog organization and wanted to look at something. She said fine. The shop was hers for another 20 minutes, and then it was mine anyway. I went through the floor stock systematically. Not every item there were hundreds of items on the floor, and I didn't have the time, but I focused on the categories that matched the backroom items. Cameras, watches, decorative boxes, small collectibles. I read every physical tag I could access without disturbing the display cases. Nothing. Standard tags, standard handwriting that wasn't mine, standard annotation patterns. Then Deshauna left, and Carl locked up from the inside and handed me the keys with his usual nod, and I was alone. I checked the sold records in the inventory system, items that had moved in the past 4 weeks. I could pull the item numbers and cross-reference, but there were no digital records of handwritten annotations. Those only existed on the physical tags, which left the shop with the item when it sold. So if there had been earlier labeled items that had already sold, I had no way to know. I wrote that in the notebook. No way to verify historical scope, maybe ongoing longer than 4 weeks. Then I sat at the terminal and made myself think about the items themselves again. Not the tags, the items. Shoebox, contents unknown. Watch, unbranded mechanical vintage, unassessed. Camera, Pentax, 35mm mid-70s. Object inside second lens. Wooden box, assessed and floor-ready before the secondary tag appeared, now sitting near the back door on the cleaning supply shelf. 4 items. The notes treated them as a group, not with the others. Keep separate, which meant the notes assumed I knew which ones were the others, which meant whoever was writing the notes assumed I had been following along, assumed I was tracking them the same way I was, in fact, tracking them. That was the part I kept bumping against. The notes were not addressed to anyone. They didn't say to whoever finds this or attention staff or any of the usual impersonal phrasing of a workplace instruction. They were written with the implicit assumption that the reader would know what they meant, that the reader was already in the situation. I opened the shoebox on a Saturday night. Week 5. I had gone back and forth about it for a long time, long enough to feel like I was being controlled by a piece of cardboard with my own handwriting on it, which is not a state I'm comfortable accepting. The note said, "Not ready," and I had respected that for a month. But ready implied a condition that would change, and nothing had changed. No update in the system, no instruction rescinding the hold. And the box was the oldest of the 4 items, the first one. And if there was a logic here, and I had started to believe there was a logic, even if I couldn't name it, then the box was probably where it started. I cut the packing tape with a box cutter, slowly, along the edges. I wasn't going to rush it. Inside, packed in tissue paper, were photographs, not digital prints, actual photographs, silver gelatin prints, old ones, the slightly warm-toned black and white of mid-century processing. Maybe 40 of them, maybe more. I took them out in careful stacks and laid them on the work table under the fluorescent light. They were photographs of a house, exterior and interior, different seasons based on the foliage and light, taken over what looked like a span of several years, given the variations in camera angle and print quality. A 2-story house with a wide front porch, a detached garage, a large oak tree in the front yard. Rural or semi-rural, based on the sight lines, no neighboring houses visible in the exterior shots. A gravel driveway. I went through all of them. Most were architectural, almost documentary in feeling. The rooms of the house, doorways and windows and stairs, a kitchen, a basement staircase with the door partially open. One photograph was different. It was the only one with a person in it. A man, standing in the backyard of the house, facing partially away from the camera, taken from inside, through a window, based on the slight reflection in the lower right corner of the print. He was wearing a work jacket, dark, and his posture was the posture of someone looking at something specific in the yard, something beyond the frame. I couldn't see his face clearly, partially turned away, partially shadowed by the tree. I could see his hands. I recognized the hands before I understood why. Then I understood why. They were my father's hands. I know how that sounds. Hands are not faces. Hands are not fingerprints. I am aware that I may have wanted to see something familiar, and so I saw it. But my father had a specific scar on the back of his right hand from a table saw accident in 1987 when I was a teenager. A pale, raised line that ran diagonally across the knuckles. He'd needed 8 stitches, and he'd refused to let my mother drive him to the hospital, and the resulting argument had become one of those family stories that gets told at every gathering forever. The man in the photograph had the same scar on his right hand. I put all the photographs back in the box and sat down on the floor with my back against the shelving unit. I knew one thing with certainty. My father had never pawned anything in his life. He kept things. That was the entire nature of his relationship to objects. He kept them long past any rational justification for keeping them. If these photographs existed, and were of his hands, and were in a pawn shop intake box, then someone had brought them in after he died. Someone who had access to things he owned. My sister, a cousin, a neighbor who'd helped clear the house. Or they had been here longer than his death, which I couldn't make work chronologically no matter how I arranged it, because the intake date on the box was 8 weeks ago. 8 weeks ago, my father had been dead for 18 months. I called my sister on Sunday, Helen. She'd handled most of the estate because I wasn't in a state to, and she was, and that's a debt I still carry. I asked her, as neutrally as I could manage, whether she'd sold or donated any of Dad's photographs, his photography collection. She said he didn't really have a photography collection. He had cameras, yes, but he wasn't a photographer. She said as far as she knew, all the cameras had gone to an estate sale company they'd hired. I asked which company. She gave me a name. I wrote it down. Then she asked why I was asking, with the particular caution of someone who has been through grief with a sibling and knows when the grief is moving rather than resting. I told her I was doing inventory work at a shop that bought estate sale items, and I'd come across something that seemed like it might have been Dad's. I said I was probably wrong. She said if I found something I thought was his, I should just keep it. The estate was long settled, and nobody needed anything from it, and I said I would. And we talked for a few more minutes about nothing, and then said goodbye. I looked up the estate sale company. Standard local operation. They'd been running for 12 years, reasonably reviewed. I could find no obvious connection to Pickett's buy-sell trade, but estate sale companies sold to dealers all the time. It was the most natural pipeline in the world. Dealer buys bulk lot from estate sale, resells individually. Pickett could have bought a lot that included my father's things without knowing whose things they were. That was entirely plausible. The box of photographs, the watch, the camera my father had owned, all those categories of object. The wooden box, too. I sat with that for a long time. 4 items from what might be my father's estate, sitting in the back room of a pawn shop where I happened to be working the night shift, and handwritten labels on each of them in my handwriting telling me to leave them alone. I had two ways to interpret that, and I couldn't decide which one was worse. Either someone knew the connection between me and these items before I did, and was directing my attention towards them deliberately, or the items themselves were producing the labels somehow, in a logic I couldn't approach rationally, and the handwriting was mine, because I was the one they were meant for. I didn't go to sleep Sunday. I just sat in my apartment and waited for evening. That night, I examined the watch properly for the first time. I removed it from the tray and turned it over. The case back was plain, no engraving, which was common for utilitarian pieces of that era. But there was a slight gap in the case back seam, the kind that means the case has been opened and not fully reseated. I used a thumbnail and then a flathead from the small kit I'd started keeping in my jacket, and I worked the case back loose. On the inner surface of the case back, engraved in small letters, was a name. My father's name. His full name, first, middle, last, and below it, a date. Not a year I recognized as significant. Not his birth date or my mother's, or any anniversary I knew of. The date was 14 months from now. I put the watch back in the tray, and the tray back on the shelf, and I stood at the utility sink and ran cold water over my wrists for about 2 minutes. Not because I was going to faint. I just needed something immediate and physical, and the cold water was there. My father's full name. 3 names, first, middle, last. The middle name being Clarence, which he had hated his entire life, and which appeared on no informal document he ever produced. It was on his birth certificate and his death certificate, and apparently on the inside of a watch case in the back room of a pawn shop in a city he had visited maybe 4 times. The date I kept returning to. 14 months from now put it in late autumn of next year. No significance I could locate. Not a birthday, not an anniversary, not any date that had ever mattered to anyone in my family as far as I knew. Just a date, precise, month, day, year, future tense. I went back to the terminal and sat down and opened my notebook and wrote everything down, while my hands were still doing the slight, unsteady thing that I was pretending they weren't doing. Then I did what I do when information doesn't fit a framework. I tried to find a framework it fit. Option 1. The watch had belonged to my father. He had commissioned the engraving himself for reasons unknown, perhaps as a reminder of something, perhaps as an eccentricity. The date was something private, whose significance I simply didn't know. This explained the engraving and explained nothing else. Option 2. Someone had engraved the watch after my father's death. Someone who knew his full name, knew the date, knew the watch would end up in this shop, knew I would be here to find it. This required a degree of orchestration that was either elaborate human planning or something else, and I was trying very hard to stay in the human planning column. Option 3. I had been brought here specifically for this. Not by Marcus, not by Pickett, not by any person with a reason I could identify. Brought here by the same logic that was producing labels in my handwriting on items from my dead father's estate. And the date was not something from the past that I'd missed. It was something in the future that I hadn't arrived at yet. I wrote all 3 options in the notebook. I stared at them for a while. Then I wrote underneath, find out what the object in the lens is. It came out when I tilted the lens barrel downward at a specific angle. A coin. Old, worn, smooth on the high points. The design on both faces reduced to soft suggestions of what it had once been. The metal was pale, not silver bright, not gold, something between. I didn't know enough about antique coins to identify it by sight, and I wasn't going to find out by running a search on my phone at midnight, but I knew enough to know it was genuinely old. The wear pattern wasn't the wear of a coin that had been circulated recently. It was the wear of something that had been handled repeatedly over a very long span of time. I put it on the work table under the light. It was roughly the size of a quarter. One face had what I thought was a profile, a head in profile, but the features were nearly gone. The other face had a design I couldn't resolve into anything specific. Not letters, not a clear symbol. My father had owned coins. Of course he had. He'd owned coins the way he'd owned everything else, in accumulation, with enthusiasm, with varying degrees of research behind the acquisitions. I photographed both faces of the coin. Then I put it back in the lens barrel, put the lens back in the bin, and left the camera on the shelf. Then I went and looked at the wooden box for a long time. It was still where I'd moved it, far end of the room, bottom shelf near the cleaning supplies. The secondary tag I'd found on it said not with the others, keep separate. I had moved it. I had done exactly what the tag said. I'd been doing what the tag said since the beginning. I thought about that in a new way. I opened the wooden box at 2:47 in the morning, which I know because I wrote the time in the notebook before I touched the clasp. Inside was a letter, a single piece of paper, folded in thirds, the way you fold a letter to fit an envelope. The paper was not old. It was ordinary printer paper, white, the kind you buy in reams. The fold lines were crisp. This had been written recently. It was addressed to me. Not to whom it may concern, not to my son or any familial abstraction. My first name at the top, the name people who know me use, not my formal name, just the short version. The handwriting was mine. I want to be very precise here. I have tried, in the months since then, to find an explanation for the handwriting that doesn't require me to accept what I eventually accepted. Graphologists will tell you that no two people's handwriting is identical, that the individual variations in pressure and rhythm and letter formation are reliable identifying markers. I don't know enough about graphology to argue with that. What I know is that I read that letter, and every sentence felt like something I had written. Not in the sense of familiarity, but in the sense of recognition. The same recognition I have when I hear a recording of my own voice. The cadence, the specific word choices, the way I make a subordinate clause and then don't quite close it before moving to the next thought. The letter said, "You've been careful with them, and that matters. The photographs are safe where they are. Don't separate them from the box. The coin needs to stay in the lens until the lens is sold. Don't let that happen before November. The watch is the important one." You know the date now, and I can't explain it the way you want me to. What I can tell you is that it's not when something ends. It's when something needs to be decided, and you'll have enough information by then to make the decision correctly if you pay attention between now and then. The shop is part of it. Pickett knows more than he's told you. Not everything, but more. Ask him about the provenance on the camera lot. Don't ask Marcus anything. Marcus doesn't know and can't help. I know this isn't the form you'd want this in. I know you want a rational explanation, and I don't have one that would satisfy you. All I have is this. I had more time than we thought I did after the stroke. Not time the way we count it, but time to do a few things. This was one of the things. Don't rush the November date. Just stay. It wasn't signed. It didn't need to be. I sat on the floor of the back room of a pawn shop at 3 in the morning, holding a letter in my own handwriting from my dead father, and I did not have a response to that. That language is adequate of 4, so I won't try to find one. I'll just say that I sat there for a while, long enough that the fluorescent light's hum stopped being a sound and became something more like a condition. Long enough that the cold of the concrete floor came through my jeans. I didn't cry, which surprised me, and also didn't. because I've never been someone who cries easily, and grief had already taken a lot of what I had available for that. What I felt, when I could identify what I felt, was not fear. That surprised me more. It was something closer to recognition. The specific sensation of a thing you have been half knowing moving into the part of your mind where you actually know things. He had been a collector. He had spent his whole life paying close attention to objects, to what they were made of, where they had been, what they connected to. He had believed, not in any religious way, not in any way he would have articulated as belief, that things carried meaning, that the history of an object was part of the object. He'd never said it in those words. But I'd watched him hold a coin for 10 minutes before deciding whether to buy it, the way you'd watch someone listen to music, and I knew what he was doing. I had always thought that was a nice idea with no actual content. I was now in the position of reconsidering that. I stayed until 6 without doing any more inventory work. I just sat with the items and the letter and my notebook. When Carl showed up at 5:50 to open, I was at the terminal looking at the monitor like everything was normal. I said the overnight had been quiet. He said good, and went to unlock the front gate, and I went home. I slept for 4 hours. Then I got up and looked up everything I could find about the estate sale company my sister had named. Standard records, their website, business filings, nothing unusual. They had sold at least a partial lot to Pickett's buy-sell trade 14 months ago, based on a cross-reference I was able to do through a secondary reseller listing I found online. 14 months ago, which meant Pickett had these items, or some of them, before I started working there, before Marcus had offered me the job. I wrote that in the notebook. Then I drew a line under it and wrote, Marcus. I had been assuming Marcus's involvement was incidental. He knew Pickett. The shop needed help. He'd thought of me. Simple. Coincidental. But Marcus had also known my father. Not well, but they'd met enough times at family events. He'd been at the funeral. He knew my father had collected things, had known it for the years he'd been married to my sister. I called Marcus at noon. I didn't ask about the provenance. I asked how he'd heard that the shop needed someone for overnight. He said Pickett had mentioned it. I asked when. A pause. Not a long one, but present. He said he wasn't sure exactly, a few weeks before he'd called me. I asked if Pickett had specifically suggested me, or if Marcus had volunteered me. Another pause. Marcus said Pickett had asked if he knew anyone reliable with an inventory background, and Marcus had thought of me. I said that made sense, and changed the subject, and got off the call. Pickett had asked for someone with an inventory background. There are employment agencies for that. There are posting boards. The specific route of asking Marcus, who was only a partial owner, who had a specific family connection to a specific person, that was not the obvious route to finding someone with an inventory background. That was the route to finding me. I went in 2 hours early again that night. Carl was still there. Pickett wasn't. I told Carl I wanted to look at the provenance records for a camera lot that had come in about 14 months ago. I said I was trying to clean up some of the older intake documentation as part of the backlog work. Carl said that kind of thing would be in the paper files in the filing cabinet under the terminal. He said Pickett kept hard copies of all provenance documentation because the software had crashed twice in 2019, and he didn't trust it. I waited until Carl left. Then I opened the filing cabinet. The files were organized by intake date, which made it straightforward. 14 months back. I found the folder. The camera lot had come from the estate sale company, as I'd established. The lot included 12 items, all listed. Cameras, lenses, accessories. The Pentax body and its 2 lenses were items 7 and 8 on the list. I photographed the document. Stapled behind the provenance sheet was a second document. A personal letter, handwritten, apparently included with the lot by the estate sale company as part of the provenance chain. This was unusual. Personal correspondence wasn't typically part of a provenance file for an ordinary estate lot, but Pickett had kept it. The letter was from my father. His handwriting, the generous loose script I knew, and that was nothing like mine. Written to no one specifically, or to whoever ended up with the things. The kind of letter a person writes when they are in the process of putting things in order and are being thorough about it. It was brief. It said the cameras and related equipment had been in his possession for most of his adult life, that some of the items had significance beyond their assessed value, and that he hoped they would find a home with someone who understood that. He said there was a coin inside one of the lenses that should stay there until the right circumstances for its removal. He didn't explain what those circumstances were. He had dated the letter. The date was 2 weeks after his stroke. He had written this 2 weeks after his stroke, when he was, by every account from my sister who had been with him, barely able to hold a pen and only intermittently lucid. The letter was clear, articulate, and entirely coherent. The handwriting was steady. I stood there with the letter in my hands, and I understood that there were things my sister had not told me about those 2 weeks, and I understood why. And I understood that my father had been doing exactly what he'd always done, which was paying close attention to an object in this case, his remaining time, and finding the meaning in it. Pickett had read this letter. Pickett had kept it. And then Pickett had asked Marcus if he knew anyone with an inventory background. I walked out to the front of the shop and stood in the amber case light and looked at the displayed items in their cases, and I felt the specific anger of someone who has been maneuvered into something with good intentions by someone else's good intentions, which is the hardest kind of anger to do anything with. Then I went back to the terminal and waited for Pickett, because he was coming. I was certain of that in the same way I was certain of the handwriting. He had put this together carefully. He was the kind of man who checked on things. At 11:42, the back door opened. He knocked twice before using the key. Same as last time. I had the letter on the work table, face up, when he came in. He saw it immediately. He was the kind of man who scanned a room when he entered it, not suspiciously, just by habit, the way people do when they've been responsible for a physical space for a long time. His eyes went to the letter, and then to me, and then he closed the back door and threw the deadbolt. He didn't say anything at first. He poured coffee. He looked at the letter again from across the room, not moving toward it, just confirming what it was. Then he pulled the rolling stool from under the terminal and sat down on it and held his mug with both hands. "You found the provenance file," he said. "Yes. I figured you would eventually. You're thorough." He said it without flattery, as a simple observation. That's why your father wanted someone thorough. I let that settle before I responded. He asked you to hire me. He asked me to make sure the items reached you correctly. He didn't specify how. Pickett looked at his coffee. Marcus was the obvious route. You'd come in, you'd find them at your own pace. You wouldn't feel like you were being handed something. He didn't want me to feel managed. He said you didn't take things well when they came from above. His words. That was accurate enough that it was briefly painful. How did you know him? Pickett turned the mug in his hands. Estate sale, about 8 years ago. I bought a lot from a house 2 counties over. Turned out some of it had history he was researching. He came in to ask about a piece. We talked for 4 hours. He came back. A slight pause. Some people you just keep talking to. I understood that. My father had been that kind of person. He could make anyone feel like the conversation they were having was the most interesting one available. "The letter he wrote," I said. "You read it?" "Yes. He wrote it 2 weeks after his stroke. My sister said he could barely hold a pen." Pickett looked at me steadily. Your sister was with him most of those 2 weeks, not all of them. I didn't ask what that meant, because I thought I already knew, and I needed a few more minutes before I was ready to know it confirmed. The date in the watch, I said. You knew about that. He told me there was something inside the case. He didn't tell me what. 14 months from now. Do you know what it means? No. He said it simply, without the hesitation of someone concealing something. He said you would know what to do with it when you reached it. He said the timing would be clear. I picked up the letter from the work table. My own handwriting. My father's words, somehow, in my handwriting, telling me to stay, to pay attention, to wait for November. I had read it 6 times since finding it, and it still produced the same doubling sensation each time, the feeling of hearing your own voice from somewhere you're not standing. The labels on the tags, I said. The handwriting. Pickett was quiet for a moment. I didn't write those. I know you didn't. The items came in the way they came in. I logged them the way they came in. The tags were there when I processed the lot. He met my eyes. I don't have an explanation for the handwriting. I've been doing this for 37 years, and I don't have an explanation for that. It was the first time he'd said something that openly. It cost him something. I could tell. The same way it costs a practical man to say out loud that he encountered something he couldn't account for. He was not a person who enjoyed that kind of admission. Neither was I. Maybe that was why my father had trusted him. We talked for another hour. Not everything, not a complete accounting, but enough. Pickett told me that my father had been specific about the sequence. The photographs first, because those were just evidence, documentation of something. The watch second, because that was the center of it. The date, the name. The letter last, because the letter was the part that required everything else to already be in place. He had not known about the coin in the lens. When I told him, he nodded slowly, the way someone nods when a detail they'd been missing clicks into a pattern they'd already been seeing. Your father collected things that were older than their occasions, he said. Things that had been used long enough to accumulate something. He paused. I know how that sounds. I'm past caring how things sound. He believed that certain objects operated as connective tissue, between times, between people. He looked at the shelving. He wasn't naive about it. He knew he couldn't prove any of it, but he'd handled enough things over enough years to have a position on it. My father had never said any of this to me directly. I didn't know whether to feel that as grief or as a specific kind of failure, mine or his, and I still don't know. Some things don't resolve into one feeling cleanly. Why November? I said. Why that date? He didn't tell me the date. He just said you'd have decisions to make, and the timing would matter and you'd know it when you got there. I thought about the engraving, the precision of it, month, day, year. That wasn't the language of someone being approximate about timing. He planned this before the stroke, I said. He planned what he'd do in the time after it. Pickett looked at me. I think he planned it because he knew the stroke was coming. Not exactly, but he knew something was coming, and he was the kind of man who didn't leave things undone. My father had not told me the stroke was coming. He had not told my sister either, as far as I knew. He had told a pawn shop owner in a city he didn't live in, and he had left items behind with instructions, and he had somehow produced labels in my handwriting on those items, and he had written a coherent letter 2 weeks after his brain had partially failed. And none of that was something I could make orderly in the freight inventory part of my mind that wanted everything to have a logical sequence. But I was also my father's son, and my father had spent his entire life taking seriously the possibility that objects and time were more porous than they appeared. He had done it quietly, and practically, the way you'd take seriously any other unprovable but useful working hypothesis. He had not needed anyone else to validate it. I had spent my entire life being more skeptical than him, and I had the notebook in my jacket pocket with my own handwriting on 40 pages of documentation about something I still couldn't explain. So perhaps the skepticism had been more performance than substance. I told Pickett about moving the wooden box. He said that was correct. Based on what he understood from my father's instructions, the box and the photographs were meant to stay separate from the watch and camera. They operated differently. He hadn't known quite how to arrange it, and had been hoping I'd figure it out. The fact that he'd been hoping I would figure things out was not entirely comforting. Before he left, I asked him the question I'd been holding since I read the letter. Did he say anything about why it had to be me that found them? Why not my sister? Pickett considered that with genuine care, the way he'd considered everything. He said Helen would have needed explanations. He said you would just follow the evidence. A slight pause. He also said you'd been carrying something since he died that you hadn't put down yet, and that you needed somewhere to put it. I didn't respond to that. Pickett said goodnight and went out the back door. I heard him walk down the alley. I kept the job through November. 14 months turned out to mean the third week of the month, though I didn't know that specifically until I was inside it and could recognize it, the way my father had said I would. What happened in the third week of November was not dramatic. I want to be honest about that because I think if you've been following any of this, you might expect something dramatic. A convergence, a revelation with visual weight. There wasn't. What there was a decision. My sister called me on a Tuesday. She said she'd found more of our father's papers while reorganizing her spare room. Papers she'd boxed during the estate clearance and never fully gone through. She said there were things she thought I should see. She said she hadn't read all of it, but what she had read seemed like it had been meant for me. And she was sorry it had taken her so long to go through everything. She hadn't been ready before now. I told her not to apologize. She had done everything when neither of us was capable of doing anything, and she didn't owe apologies for the pace at which she recovered from that. She drove down that weekend. We sat at my kitchen table for most of Saturday going through the papers. Research notes mostly. His handwriting, the generous loose script, years of it, accumulated across decades of collecting and curiosity. And within it, a section that was different from the rest. Not about objects, or not only about objects, but about inheritance. What a person leaves. The difference between the things you leave intentionally and the things you leave without knowing you've left them. He had written about me. Not constantly, but in a thread running through the later years of the notes, the last decade. References to conversations we'd had and things he'd observed. He wrote that I had his way of paying attention to things without admitting I was paying attention to them. He wrote that he'd always thought I'd be good at the work he did if I ever gave myself permission to take it seriously, meaning not the collecting, but the underlying practice of it, the attending to things. He wrote, in notes dated about 3 years before his death, that he had something to give me and hadn't found the right moment, and was starting to think the right moment would need to be constructed rather than waited for. I sat at my kitchen table with my sister across from me, and I understood that I had been inside a constructed moment for 14 months. That the job, the tags, the box, the watch, the coin, the letter, none of it had been accidental or supernatural in the sense of being outside of my father. It had been entirely him. His methodology applied to the largest problem he'd ever faced, which was how to hand something to a person who needed his hands to let go of it first. Helen watched me read. She didn't say anything for a while. Then she said, "He really got in your head, didn't he?" I laughed. Actually laughed. The first real one in a long time. "He planned it," I said. "Of course he planned it. He planned everything." She refilled her coffee. "He told me, about a year before the stroke, that he was worried about you. Not in a crisis way. Just that you'd built a very small life, and he thought you were capable of a larger one, and he didn't know how to say that to you without it landing wrong." "It would have landed wrong," I said. "I know. That's what I told him. I still have the watch. Pickett let me take it when I eventually explained the engraving. He said it was never properly shop inventory anyway. It was always mine. It had just needed a place to wait. The coin I kept in the lens until late November, then removed it. I have it on my desk. I've had it examined by 2 numismatists, and neither of them can identify the mint or the period with confidence. Both said it was genuinely old. One said it had the wear pattern of something that had exchanged hands continuously for centuries. She said it like it was a curiosity. I treated it like the information it was. The photographs are in the shoebox, which is on my shelf now. I've gone through them carefully, many times. The house in the photographs I eventually identified through records, research a rural property in the county where my father grew up, sold out of the family in the late 1950s. The man in the backyard photograph I cannot identify with certainty. I can see his hands. I can see the diagonal scar across the right knuckles. I have decided, and this is a decision rather than a conclusion, that some things are better held than resolved. The job at the pawn shop ended in December, naturally, when Pickett hired a permanent overnight person and didn't need me anymore. We shook hands. He didn't say much. He's not a man who overspeaks moments that are already complete. I took a position doing inventory assessment for an estate sale company in the spring. Different one from the firm that had handled my father's estate. I find I'm good at it, in a way I wasn't good at the freight work, which is that I'm not just processing objects, I'm reading them, looking at what they've been, and where they've been, and what they connect to. My father would recognize what I'm doing, the underlying motion of it, even if the objects are different. The November date on the watch has passed. Nothing external happened on that day. I went to work. I came home. I made dinner. I sat with the watch on the table, and I thought about my father, and I thought about the coin, and I thought about the letter in my handwriting. And at a certain point in the evening, something that had been held in a particular configuration inside me for 2.5 years quietly shifted. I don't have language for what shifted exactly, just that it did. That something that had been held at the same taut angle since the morning my sister called me about the stroke was now held differently. He had said the date wasn't when something ended. He had said it was when something needed to be decided, and that I'd have enough information by then to decide correctly. I think he was right. I think the decision was small, internal, and entirely mine, which is exactly the kind of decision he would have understood, and exactly the kind he would never have tried to make for me directly. The watch keeps good time. I've had it serviced. It runs about 4 seconds fast per day, which the watchmaker said is typical for a movement of that age and is easily corrected, but never perfectly eliminated. 4 seconds per day. I've stopped correcting it. I set it accurately on the 1st of each month and let it run. I don't know what the coin is. I don't know how the handwriting happened. I don't know what my father found in those 2 weeks after his stroke that let him write a steady letter and arrange a sequence of events that took 14 months to complete. I have hypotheses, and I hold them loosely, the way he always told me to hold things I couldn't verify. What I know is that he found a way to give me something through the only methodology he had fully trusted, which was objects and time. and the attention of someone who doesn't quit until the inventory makes sense. I kept the letter,